The cold was a thief. It stole the feeling from her fingertips first, then crept with icy malice up her arms. Lyra stared at the fallen branch, a dozen paces from her cottage door. A dozen paces might as well have been a mile. It was good, dry pine, seasoned by the frost. It would burn hot and keep the creeping damp of the cottage at bay for another night. But it was too far. Everything was always too far. She pushed herself up from the rough-hewn chair she'd dragged onto the porch, her arms trembling with the effort. Her legs were useless things, dead weight she'd been dragging behind her for 5 years. The splintery wood of the porch floor bit into her palms as she lowered herself, the cold of it a familiar shock. From here, she would have to crawl. The humiliation was a constant, bitter companion. It tasted like ash in her mouth. She was 23 years old, and she crawled through the snow for firewood like a crippled animal. The first few feet were agony. Sharp stones hidden beneath the thin layer of snow sliced at her hands. The wet cold soaked through the knees of her thin trousers instantly, a brutal, biting chill that went straight to the bone. She kept her eyes fixed on the branch. Just a little further. Her world had shrunk to these small, desperate victories: a warm fire, a full stomach. Another day survived. She was a ghost in this place, a forgotten footnote in the history of the great mountain that loomed over her. Home to the Alpha King and his legendary pack. They lived in their fortress of stone and warmth, feasting in great halls while she shivered in a hovel on the edge of their territory. The irony was not lost on her. It was his pack's carelessness that had put her here. A hunting party of young, reckless wolves, drunk on their own power, who hadn't looked before they'd leaped. They'd sent a stag crashing down the ravine, and her with it. They had howled their apologies. They had left her this cottage, a pittance for a broken life. Then they had forgotten her. Her breath came in ragged, white plumes. The air was thin and sharp, smelling of pine and impending snow. Her arms screamed in protest, the muscles burning with a fire that provided no warmth. She reached the branch, her fingers numb and clumsy as they closed around the rough bark. Victory. A small, pathetic victory, but it was hers. She began to drag it back, the scraping sound loud in the immense silence of the forest. But the effort had cost her too much. A wave of dizziness washed over her, the world tilting violently. The snow-dusted trees spun, her grip loosened. Blackness frayed the edges of her vision. No, not now. Not out here. She tried to push herself up, to keep moving, but her body refused. It was done. The cold, which had been a thief, now felt like an embrace. A final deadly peace. It whispered to her, promising an end to the pain, the humiliation, the loneliness. It would be so easy to just close her eyes, to let the snow cover her like a blanket. The thought was terrifying. And it was tempting. So terribly tempting. As her consciousness began to fade, a new element broke the silence. Not the whisper of the wind, but the heavy, deliberate crunch of paws on snow. Massive paws. She forced her eyes open, her heart seizing with a primal fear. A wolf? It was enormous, larger than any she had ever seen. Its fur was the color of shadow and silver, a shifting coat of midnight and moonlight. It moved with an impossible grace, a predator at the absolute apex of its power. This was no young, reckless wolf from a hunting party. This was something ancient, something royal. Section. But it didn't snarl. It didn't lower its head to attack. It stopped a few feet away, its head tilted. Its eyes were not the amber or brown she expected. They were gold. Molten gold. Intelligent and weary. They held the weight of centuries. Fear was a distant thing, buried under the encroaching cold. She could only stare, mesmerized. The great wolf took another step, then another, until it stood over her. It lowered its massive head, its warm breath ghosting across her frozen cheek. It smelled of winter and ozone and something else, something deeply masculine and powerful. Then it did the last thing she would have ever expected. It lay down in the snow beside her, curling its immense body around her smaller, broken one. A solid wall of heat and muscle blocking the wind, a living furnace against her back. The sheer shock of it was a jolt to her system. The warmth was immediate, penetrating, chasing away the deadly numbness that had been claiming her. She didn't understand. Wolves were pack. They were swift, brutal, and lived by a code she couldn't fathom. They did not play nursemaid to crippled humans on their borders, especially not a wolf like this. This was a king. She knew it in her bones. Time lost its meaning. She lay there, tucked against the body of a predator, not dying. The golden eyes watched the path back to her cottage, a silent, patient sentinel. The cold was still there, a deep ache in her bones, but the wolf's body heat was keeping the killing edge of it at bay. Then, the air shimmered around the beast. The solid lines of its form wavered like heat rising from pavement. The change was silent, fluid, and utterly terrifying. Fur receded, bones shifted with a sickening lack of sound. Where the wolf had been, a man now knelt. He was as formidable as the wolf had been. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that looked carved from the mountain's granite. His hair was black, shot through with silver, and his eyes. They were the same molten gold. He wore simple black clothes that did nothing to hide the sheer power rippling beneath. He was the Alpha King, Kale. A legend she'd only heard whispered about. His expression was not one of kindness or concern. It was a mask of cold fury. "Who are you?" His voice was deep, a low rumble that vibrated in her chest. It wasn't a question. It was a demand, backed by an authority that could command armies and stop hearts. She tried to answer, but her throat was frozen. Only a dry, rasping sound came out. He looked down at her useless legs half buried in the snow, at her torn and bleeding hands, and his face tightened. It wasn't pity. It was annoyance. She was a problem. A complication he had no time for. Without another word, he scooped her up. One arm went under her back, the other beneath her knees. She weighed nothing to him. The contact was a shock, his body a furnace against her frozen skin. He held her as if she were a bundle of sticks, his jaw tight. He strode back to the cottage, his long legs eating up the distance she had crawled with such agonizing effort. He kicked the door open and deposited her unceremoniously in the rickety chair by the dead hearth. He stood over her, a looming shadow in the dim light of the single window. "Why is my wolf refusing to leave this place?" he demanded, his voice laced with an icy impatience. "What are you?" Her own anger, long dormant under a layer of weary resignation, began to stir. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a familiar, bitter fire. She saw the sigil on the leather brace of his wrist, the snarling wolf's head of the royal pack. The same sigil the young wolves had worn. Her voice, when it finally came, was rough with disuse, but clear. "I am the woman your pack crippled and left to rot." The words hung in the air between them, sharp and jagged. She expected him to deny it, to dismiss her. Instead, a flicker of something unreadable passed through his golden eyes. He looked at her legs, then back to her face. The silence stretched, thick with a tension that was different now. It was no longer just the clash of a king and a commoner. It was something personal. "5 years ago," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "The ravine north of the river. Your hunters." He didn't move a muscle, but she felt a change in the room's atmosphere. The air grew colder, heavier. It was radiating from him. "I was not here 5 years ago," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I was at war in the north." "Your pack," she spat, the word tasting like poison. Your responsibility. He stared at her, his face an impenetrable mask. She was a broken thing, hurling accusations at a king who could kill her with a thought. And yet, she felt no fear. All she felt was a white-hot rage that had been simmering for half a decade. She had nothing left to lose. He turned away from her abruptly, pacing the small confines of the cottage. 3 strides took him from one wall to the other. He was a caged predator, his power barely contained by his human form. The cottage, her entire world, was a cage he could barely fit inside. My wolf has not shown himself in 3 years, he said, his back to her. He is quiet, fading. Yet he finds you, and now he sits outside your door and refuses to move. He is all that is left of my connection to the soul of this pack, and he is fixated on you. He turned back, his eyes burning into her. You are a complication I cannot afford. Her damage was visible, a ruin of flesh and bone. But as she looked at him, at the profound, ancient weariness in his eyes, she saw his. It was a wound deep inside him, a hollowing out of his very soul. His wolf was dying. The great beast of legend was fading into silence, and this man, this king, was being left alone in the echoing quiet. They were 2 broken creatures, trapped in their own private prisons, and for some reason, fate had slammed their cells together. He was her adversary, the embodiment of the power that had destroyed her life, and she was his. A puzzle, a weakness, a distraction from the slow death happening inside him. Then leave, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Tell your wolf to heal and go back to your fortress. A harsh, mirthless smile touched his lips. If only it were that simple. He is the king, in here. He tapped his chest. I am merely the man who carries him, and he has chosen to stand guard. He looked at the door, then back at her, his expression grim. Which means, for now, you are my prisoner. Or I am yours. The days that followed were a silent war. Kale did not leave. His wolf, a vast, silent shadow, remained curled by the cottage door, a constant, unnerving presence. Kale himself kept his distance, a storm cloud of brooding energy on the edge of her small world. He would disappear for hours, returning with an armful of firewood that would last for days, or a freshly hunted rabbit, skinned and cleaned, which he would leave on her porch without a word. He was tending to her needs with the detached efficiency of a jailer. He was keeping her alive, but he made it clear he resented every moment of it. Lyra watched him from her window, her heart a knot of conflicting emotions. She hated him. She hated his power, his health, the effortless way he moved through the world that had been stolen from her. She hated him for representing the pack that had broken her. But she had not been this warm, this well-fed, in 5 years. The fear of freezing to death in her sleep, a constant companion, had receded. The gnawing hunger in her belly was gone. He was providing for her, and the reluctant care was more infuriating than outright cruelty would have been. It confused her. They were adversaries, locked in a strange stalemate. He saw her as a liability, a bizarre final command from his fading spirit half. She saw him as the face of her suffering. The air in the cottage crackled with their unspoken animosity. You could at least look at me like I'm not a piece of filth you found on your boot, she said one evening, her voice sharp. He had just entered, bringing a gust of frigid air with him to place a steaming bowl of stew on her small table. He froze, his back to her. He set the bowl down with a heavy thud. I am keeping you alive, he stated, his voice a low growl. Is that not enough? Why are you? She shot back. You're the king. You could have me moved. You could have me killed. Why stay here and torment us both with this charade of concern? He turned slowly, his golden eyes blazing with a cold fire. Because the last piece of my soul demands it. Because the echo of my wolf, the very heart of my kingship, has decided that you, a broken woman in a forgotten hovel, are more important than the enemies gathering at my gates, or the rot spreading through my own council. His voice was raw, stripped of its regal control. For the first time, she heard not just anger, but desperation, a profound, soul-deep fear. "He is dying," Kyle whispered, the words seeming to be torn from him. "And his last act is to guard you. I don't know if you are the cause or a possible cure. I only know that I am bound to his will. So yes, I look at you, and I see the anchor that is holding me here while my kingdom cracks apart. Forgive me if I do not smile." He was right. She was a trap, a cage, and he was trapped in it with her. The thought should have brought her a grim satisfaction, a sense of justice. Instead, it just felt tragic. She looked away from the intensity of his gaze, down at her own still legs. "So we are two prisoners in the same cell." His silence was her answer. A few nights later, the fragile truce of their hostility shattered. Lyra was woken from a shallow, restless sleep by a sound from the main room. A sharp, choked gasp. It wasn't loud, but it was wrong. It was a sound of pure agony. She strained her ears, her heart pounding. There was another sound, a soft scraping, as if someone was trying to hold themselves up against a wall. "Kyle!" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. Silence. Then, a ragged breath. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through her anger. She pushed herself up, her arms shaking, and swung her legs off the small cot. She dragged herself to the floor and began to crawl towards the door of her small bedroom. The floorboards were freezing. Each movement was a struggle, her nightdress twisting around her. She pulled herself into the main room and stopped. Cale was braced against the far wall, his head thrown back, his teeth gritted. His face, usually a mask of cold control, was contorted in pain. A visible frost was creeping across the stone wall around him, originating from where his hands were pressed against it. The temperature in the room had plummeted. It was an unnatural cold, a deathly chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. It was coming from him. He shuddered, a violent tremor that shook his entire powerful frame. He slid down the wall, collapsing into a sitting position, his breath coming in shallow, frosty puffs. She crawled closer, her own animosity forgotten in the face of such profound suffering. This was not the invulnerable king. This was a man being consumed from the inside out. "What is it?" she whispered, stopping a few feet from him. He didn't open his eyes. "The price," he rasped, "of a silent wolf. The fire dies. The ice takes root." He curled in on himself, wrapping his arms around his chest as if to hold himself together. "It's getting worse." She saw it then. This wasn't just a spiritual fading. It was a physical decay. The loss of his wolf was literally killing him, freezing him from his core. All his power, all his authority, and he was dying a slow, cold death in her cottage. Her hatred felt petty and small in the face of his agony. Her own pain, the constant dull ache in her back, and the uselessness of her legs, was something she knew intimately. She recognized the shape of his suffering, even if the cause was beyond her understanding. She didn't know what to do. She couldn't touch him, couldn't offer comfort. What comfort could a cripple offer a dying king? Instead, she spoke the truth. The only thing she had. "The cold is inside you, isn't it?" Her voice was soft, not pitying, but a simple statement of fact. "It's not the mountain. It's in your blood." His eyes snapped open. The gold was dim, clouded with pain, but they focused on her with a startling intensity. He hadn't expected that. He'd expected fear, or perhaps a cruel satisfaction. He had not expected to be seen. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. In that shared moment of brokenness, the first crack appeared in the wall of hostility between them. She saw past the king to the man, and he, for the first time, saw past the cripple to the woman who understood the language of pain. The spasm passed. The unnatural cold receded, leaving him trembling and pale, but the agony had subsided from his face. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning heavily against the wall. "You should not have seen that," he said, his voice strained. "You're a terrible liar," she replied, her voice still quiet. "You pretend to be made of stone, but you're just as breakable as anyone else." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. He saw the strength in her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the unbroken spirit inside the broken body. "We are a pathetic pair, you and I," he said, and for the first time there was no anger in his voice, only a profound, weary truth. That night was the turning point. The wariness remained, but the open hostility bled away, replaced by a quiet, cautious curiosity. They began to talk, not of feelings, not of the strange connection his wolf seemed to feel, but of facts, of the prisons they inhabited. She told him about the accident. She described the flash of the stag's antlers, the surprised yelp of the young wolf, the sickening, weightless tumble into the ravine. She spoke of the pain, but more than that, she spoke of the silence that followed. The hours she lay there, shattered and alone, before someone finally found her. He listened. He didn't interrupt, didn't make excuses for his pack. He just listened, his golden eyes fixed on her face, his expression unreadable but attentive. When she was done, the cottage was silent save for the crackling of the fire he'd built. "Their names were Phelan and Rorik," he said, his voice low. "They were disciplined, stripped of rank for a year. It was not enough. It wasn't an apology. It was a judgment. A king's verdict, delivered 5 years too late. But it was something. It was an acknowledgement. For the first time, her suffering felt real to someone other than herself. In return, he spoke of his own silence. He didn't talk about his dying wolf directly, not in those words. He talked about the absence of it. "There was always a song in my head," he explained, staring into the flames. "A hum, the rhythm of the pack, the heartbeat of the mountain. My wolf was the voice in that song. Now, there is only quiet." He looked at her. "A quiet so loud it's deafening. Do you understand?" She did. She understood the silence of a life that used to be full of movement, the silence of legs that no longer walked, the silence of a future that had been stolen. "Yes," she whispered. "I understand." He started spending more time inside the cottage rather than standing guard outside. He would sit in the other chair, the one he'd repaired with his own hands, and watch the fire, content to share the silence that they both now understood. His wolf remained at the door, a massive, quiet guardian, its head often resting on the threshold, its golden eyes watching them both. One afternoon he found her struggling to rebraid her long, dark hair, her arms aching from the effort. He watched for a moment, his jaw tight. Then he crossed the room in 2 strides. "Give it to me," he commanded softly. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She hesitated. Then slowly she let her hands drop. He moved behind her chair. His large, calloused fingers were surprisingly gentle as they gathered her hair. They were cold, always so cold, but there was no malice in their touch. He worked in silence, his fingers deft and sure. He sectioned the hair, his knuckles brushing her neck, sending a shiver down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. She sat perfectly still, barely breathing. No one had touched her with such care in years. No one had touched her at all, except for the brusque, impersonal examinations of the pack healer long ago. This was different. This was intimate, and it was terrifying. He finished the braid, a thick, neat plait that hung down her back. His fingers lingered for a second at the end, a fleeting touch, before he pulled away. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice thick. "It was crooked," he said gruffly, retreating to the safety of his chair by the fire. But the air had changed. A line had been crossed. The quiet companionship they were building was a fragile thing, a tiny flame in the vast cold darkness of their lives, and it was about to be noticed. In the mountain fortress, Lord Valerius watched and waited. He was Kale's oldest advisor, a silver-haired wolf with a politician's smile and a predator's heart. He had been a friend to Kale's father. He had mentored Kale himself, and he had been slowly poisoning him for 2 years. It was a subtle poison, an ancient herb that attacked the connection between a wolf and its man, weakening the spirit, fraying the bond. It was designed to make the alpha fade, to leave the throne empty for a more stable leader. A leader like Valerius. Kale's resilience had been frustrating. The king's will was iron, but the poison was working. The wolf was silent. The king was weakening, the cold taking root in his bones. It was only a matter of time. But now, there was this complication. The king was spending his days in a derelict cottage, guarding a crippled commoner. Scouts reported that the king's wolf, the phantom that no one had seen in years, sat guard at her door. Valerius was no fool. He knew what that meant. A mate bond. A dormant one, perhaps, but a bond nonetheless. The one thing that could shatter his careful plans. A true mate bond could relight the fire in Kale's soul, burn out the poison, and restore his wolf in an instant. He could not allow that. The girl had to be removed, but killing her was risky. If the bond was already taking root, her death might send the king into a berserker rage that could level half the mountain. No. He needed a more elegant solution. If the bond was the potential cure, could it not also be the weapon? A nascent bond was a two-way street, a conduit, a channel through which power and life could flow. A cruel, brilliant plan began to form in Valerius's mind. He would not destroy the bond, he would hijack it. He would use the girl as a siphon to drain the last of Kale's fading life force and finish him for good. He gathered his most loyal guards, wolves who owed their positions to him, not the king. He fed them lies about the girl, that she was a witch, that she had ensnared the king with dark magic, weakening him, making him unfit to rule. It was an easy lie to sell. The pack was already restless, whispering about the king's strange behavior and his long absence from the fortress. "We will surround the cottage," Valerius told his men, his voice smooth and reasonable. "We will flush out the witch. The king is not in his right mind. We must rescue him from her influence." The attack came at dusk. The world was painted in shades of gray and deep purple when the howls ripped through the quiet forest. They were not the harmonious calls of the pack, but jagged, vicious snarls. Rogue sounds. Inside the cottage, Kyle shot to his feet, every muscle tense. He went to the window, peering out into the twilight. "What is it?" Lyra asked, her hands gripping the arms of her chair. "Wolves," he said, his voice a low growl. "But not pack. Their scent is wrong, twisted." His own wolf, the silent guardian, rose from the porch, a deep, menacing rumble starting in its chest. It stood, hackles raised, a silver specter against the snow. Kale turned from the window, his eyes finding hers. The gold in them was bright, fierce. The king was back. The weary, broken man was gone, replaced by a warrior preparing for battle. "Stay inside, bar the door, do not open it for anyone but me." He didn't wait for her reply. He strode to the door and melted into the twilight, the air shimmering as man became beast. She heard a roar that was pure, primal power. His wolf, finding its voice for the first time in years, a desperate cry of defiance. Lyra dragged a heavy chest in front of the door, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could hear the sounds of the fight outside, Snarls, the sickening thud of bodies colliding, the triumphant roar of Kale's wolf. He was magnificent. He was a whirlwind of silver fur and righteous fury, defending his territory, defending her. But something was wrong. The attacking wolves were clumsy, unfocused. It felt like a feint, a distraction. Then, a new presence. A man stepped out from behind the trees, his silver hair almost white in the fading light. Lord Valerius. He wasn't looking at the fight. He was looking at the cottage. At her. He raised a hand, and his lips moved in a silent chant. He held a small, dark object in his palm, something that seemed to drink the light from the air. A wave of energy, cold and nauseating, pulsed from him. It wasn't aimed at Kale. It washed over the cottage, passing through the walls as if they weren't there. It slammed into Lyra. It didn't hurt. It was worse. It felt like hooks, sinking into her soul, latching onto the fragile, unspoken connection that had been growing between her and Kale. The bond. He was using her to get to him. Outside, Kale's triumphant roar turned into a choked cry of pain. Lyra felt it as if it were her own. A sudden, debilitating weakness. The strength that had been surging through him was now pouring out of him, a torrent of life force draining away into nothing. And it was flowing through her. She was the conduit. Kyle stumbled, his massive form wavering. The other wolves, seeing their chance, swarmed him. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. The bond, which had been a quiet hum beneath the surface of her awareness, was now a river of agony. She felt his strength failing, his fire being extinguished. She felt the unnatural cold, the one she'd seen in him, flooding his system, a tidal wave of ice. He collapsed. The great wolf fell to the snow, twitching, a low whimper escaping his throat. The king had fallen. The fighting stopped. The rogue wolves backed away, their job done. Valerius walked calmly past Kale's fallen form and approached the cottage. He pushed the door. It held for a moment against the chest she'd placed there, then splintered inward under his unnatural strength. He stepped inside, his eyes finding her immediately. He smiled, a cold, triumphant expression. "A flawed vessel," he said, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked at her useless legs, "but effective enough." He strode to the center of the room, then looked back at Kale, who was now shifting back into his human form, unconscious and vulnerable in the snow. "He is weak. He always was. Too much heart. Too much honor. To choose a broken thing like you as a mate." He shook his head in mock pity. It was the final proof of his unfitness to rule. Lyra's blood ran cold. He had poisoned Kale. He had orchestrated all of this. Now, the bond must be severed, Valerius continued, turning his cold eyes back to her. He drew a wicked-looking dagger, its blade black as night. "A clean cut. Then I can finish him, and the pack will have the strong leader it deserves." He was going to kill her. And then, he was going to kill Kale. They were both helpless. He was dying in the snow outside, and she was trapped in her chair, a prisoner in her own body. This was it. The end. All that fragile hope, the shared silence, the gentle touch of his hands in her hair, it was all going to be extinguished. She looked past Valerius, through the broken door, at Kale's still form. She felt his life force fading, a flicker of a candle in a hurricane. She was connected to it. She could feel the last of his warmth being stolen by the cold. Rage was useless. Fear was pointless. There was no escape. A strange calm washed over her, a profound and terrible acceptance. She could not save him. She could not save herself. But she would not die cowering. She would not die hating. She closed her eyes. She focused on the thread of the bond, that agonizing connection to Kale. She ignored the pain, the draining sensation. She pushed past it, seeking the small, warm ember that was left of him. She had one thing left to give. Not a cry for help. not a curse on his enemy, just a farewell. A final, silent acknowledgement. I see you. The thought was not just for Kale, the king. It was for the broken man who understood her silence. The man who was dying because his soul had gone quiet. She gathered up all her sorrow, all her regret for the life she'd lost, for the connection she'd just found, and formed it into a single, pure note in her mind. A note of goodbye. She let it go. But it didn't stay in her mind. As the thought formed, it took breath. It slipped past her lips, not as a whisper, but as a sound. It was a low, single, resonant tone. It wasn't loud, but it filled the small cottage, vibrating through the floorboards, through the stone of the hearth, through the very air. It was a sound of absolute purity, like a crystal bell struck once in a silent world. Valerius froze, the dagger halfway to her throat. His eyes widened in shock, then in pain. The dark object in his hand, the one he'd used to channel his spell, began to smoke and crack. The sound wave from Lyra's voice was not a force of destruction. It was a force of truth. It washed over Valerius, and the lies that held his power together disintegrated. The spell he'd woven around the bond shattered. The illusion of loyalty he'd cast over his men outside vanished. The subtle poison that had lingered in Kale's system for years was rendered inert, unraveled by a frequency of pure reality. Outside, the rogue wolves yelped in confusion, shaking their heads as if waking from a dream. They looked at Kale's fallen form, then at Valerius, their eyes clearing with dawning horror and understanding. The sound continued, holding that one perfect note. It poured across the snow to Kale. It flowed into him, not through the corrupted bond, but through the air itself. It was the song his soul had been missing. The silence in his head was not just broken, it was obliterated by this pure, healing resonance. The unnatural ice in his veins evaporated. The fire of his life force, which had been a dying ember, roared back into an inferno. His eyes snapped open. They were not the clouded gold of a dying man. They were clear, brilliant silver, the color of the true alpha wolf, fully awakened and unbound. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the first clean breath he'd taken in years, and the air around him crackled with power. Inside the cottage, the note finally faded. Lyra slumped in her chair, gasping, the effort having taken everything she had. But she was alive, and the agonizing drain on her soul was gone. Valerius stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. What are you? She, a voice like an avalanche answered from the doorway, is my queen. Kyle stood there, no longer the weary, dying king. He was radiating power, a primal force of nature barely contained in human form. His eyes were locked on Valerius, and they promised a world of pain. You poisoned me, Kyle stated, his voice dangerously quiet. You used her. You threatened my mate. Valerius paled, stumbling backward. Kale, my king, I was trying to save you. She is a witch. She lies, Kale interrupted, taking a step into the room. And lies cannot exist in her presence. He glanced at Lyra, a look of utter awe and reverence in his silver eyes. Her voice is truth, and it has shown me everything. He moved then, a blur of speed and fury. The fight was not a fight, it was an execution. He disarmed Valerius with a flick of his wrist, the black dagger clattering to the floor. He seized the treacherous advisor by the throat, lifting him clear off the ground. The pack will have your judgment, Kale growled, his voice resonating with the power Lyra had returned to him. But your life is forfeit. You raised your hand against your queen. The pack guards, their minds now clear, had surrounded the cottage. They burst in, their expressions a mixture of fear and loyalty, their weapons drawn. They stopped short at the scene before them. Their reborn king, radiating an aura of terrifying power, holding the limp form of his traitorous advisor and the crippled girl in the chair, who watched with wide, exhausted eyes. "Take him to the dungeons," Kale commanded, dropping Valerius into their arms. "He will face the stone of truth at dawn." The guards dragged the whimpering Valerius away. The cottage fell silent again, the only sounds the crackling fire and their own breathing. The crisis was over. The threat was gone. And they were alone. Kale turned to her. The raw power was still there, a tangible aura around him. But as he looked at her, it softened. The silver in his eyes warmed, swirling with the gold she knew. He crossed the room slowly, as if approaching a sacred thing. He did not stop until he stood before her chair. Then, the Alpha King, the ruler of the mountain, the most powerful wolf on the continent, knelt. He knelt on the rough floorboards of her tiny cottage, bringing his eyes level with hers. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took her hand. His skin was still cool, but it was the coolness of a mountain stream, not the deathly chill of before. It was alive. "Your voice," he said, his own voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than gratitude, it was worship. It gave me back my own." He brought her hand to his lips, his touch reverent. "It gave me back everything." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of shock, of relief, of a bone-deep exhaustion she'd never known. She had been so sure she was going to die. She had accepted it. And in that acceptance, she had found a power she never knew she possessed. "I didn't know," she whispered. "I know," he said, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "You saved me, Lyra." "You saved me first," she replied, thinking of him lying in the snow, a wall of warmth between her and death. A slow smile spread across his face, a true smile that reached his eyes and transformed his harsh features into something devastatingly handsome. "It seems we are a matched pair after all." He didn't try to heal her. He didn't offer platitudes or promises. He simply knelt before her, holding her hand, and in that moment, she did not feel broken. She did not feel like a cripple. She felt like a queen. The reunion was not a grand declaration in a throne room. It was a quiet moment of profound connection in the ruins of the battle that had almost claimed them both. He looked at her, and she saw the truth in his eyes, a truth that needed no magical voice to be understood. He saw her, all of her, the broken body, the fierce spirit, the hidden power. And he cherished it. "I love you," he said, the words simple, direct, and as true as the note she had sung. "I think my wolf knew it from the moment he found you freezing in the snow. It took the man a little longer to catch up." Her heart, which she had thought long dead and buried under layers of bitterness, swelled with an emotion so powerful it stole her breath. Love. It was not the gentle, sweet thing of stories. It was fierce, and forged in fire and ice, in shared pain and mutual rescue. She didn't know how to say it back. The words felt inadequate. He smiled gently, understanding. "You don't have to say anything. I can hear it." Months passed. The mountain fortress was transformed. The rot Valerius had seated in the council was ruthlessly cut out, exposed by Lyra's quiet, unwavering voice in hearings that became the stuff of legend. She never raised her tone, never accused. She would simply ask a question or hum a low, resonant note, and the truth would unspool, lies withering under the pure frequency of her power. She was not a traditional queen. She rarely sat on the ornate throne beside Kale's. Her place was at the council table, in a chair he'd had carved for her from the heartwood of an ancient oak, comfortable and supportive. From there, she was his truth-sayer, his conscience, his unwavering anchor. The pack, who had at first been bewildered by their crippled queen, now revered her. They called her the Silent Queen, for she spoke little, but when she did, her words reshaped their world. Kale was a different king. The coldness that had been his armor was gone, replaced by a confident, quiet strength. His wolf was a constant presence, either at his side or, more often, lying at Lyra's feet, its great head resting on her lap. The bond between them was a river of warmth and power, a constant private conversation. He had brought the pack's greatest healers to her. They had examined her legs, the old, poorly set bones, the atrophied muscles. There was no magical cure. The damage was too old. But there was therapy. Excruciating, exhausting therapy. Kale was with her for every session. He would hold her hand, his strength a steady presence as she fought to coax life back into her deadened limbs. Her progress was slow, measured in inches. The ability to stand, leaning heavily on him, for 5 seconds. The first, trembling step taken with braces on her legs and her hands clutching his arms. Each tiny victory was a celebration. He never pushed her, never showed impatience. He was simply there, his belief in her a tangible force. One evening they were at the cottage. They came here often. It was no longer a prison, but a sanctuary. A reminder of where they had started, of the two broken people who had found each other in the snow. A fire roared in the hearth. Kale sat in his chair watching her. She stood by the window, her hands resting on the sill, supporting her own weight. She was wearing the leg braces, but she was standing. On her own. For a full minute. "You're beautiful," he said, his voice soft. She turned her head, a smile touching her lips. "I'm trembling like a leaf, and my legs feel like they're on fire." "I know," he said, his eyes glowing with warmth. "You're the strongest person I have ever known." She looked out the window at the moonlit snow. The world was so quiet, so peaceful. The silence was no longer empty. It was full of love, full of hope. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The silence?" He came to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. He helped support her weight, taking the strain from her arms. "No. My world was silent for too long." He nuzzled her neck, his breath warm against her skin. "Now, it's full of my favorite song." She leaned back against his solid strength, closing her eyes. She hummed a low, gentle note, the sound of pure contentment, and felt the vibration of it echo in his chest. He held her tighter. They were not perfect. Her legs still ached. His past still held its shadows, but they were whole. Not because their wounds had vanished, but because they had found in each other the missing pieces of their souls. The Alpha King's wolf had guarded an empty cottage, they whispered in the pack. But they were wrong. It had never been empty. It had been waiting, waiting for its queen.